My name is Christa Meindersma. I was born in The Hague in the Netherlands and I currently live in Amsterdam. I've worked for the United Nations for about 15 years as a political advisor and a negotiator in different conflict areas in the world. And later came back to Holland and was the director of a number of philanthropic foundations. Currently I'm doing non-profit work in relation to Tibet. I have never heard of Tibet. When I was a child, when I grew up, I never read a book, I never heard about the Dalai Lama. But I always wanted to leave the Netherlands. I was very, very curious. I wanted actually to leave after my secondary school, but I went on to do my studies, and after my study biochemistry, I decided to travel. And I was a mountain climber, so the logical choice was to travel to Nepal. So I traveled overland from Amsterdam to Nepal, mainly by local transport. And that for me was a cultural, political, and also a complete eye-opener to the world. And in Nepal, I met Tibetans who were on their way from Tibet for the first time ever. They were allowed to leave Tibet to go to Kalachakra, a sacred initiation given by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, in Bodh Gaya. I met these Tibetans and I just became so fascinated. Where do they come from? Who are they? Where are they going to? Why are they here? And I said to a friend of mine with whom I was together, I said, I want to go to Tibet and I want to learn Tibetan. So I went back home, searched for 4 months to find a book to learn Tibetan. This is all pre-internet, that kind of digital time. But finally I found a book, I found 2 cassette tapes, and I found a job which took me back to Nepal. And after that I traveled on to Tibet. This was in 1985-86, that period. That was a job working for a travel agency that got me back from the Netherlands to Nepal. I took a few groups traveling in the Himalaya. And after that I went on to travel to Tibet. I traveled by truck to the border of Tibet. I crossed the border. Of course there's a Chinese checkpost there. When I crossed the border I felt completely at ease. I was told to go to a special hotel for foreigners to stay there, but actually I entered and walked out in the back again and chatted with some Tibetans. They invited me to stay with them. I stayed with them the first night, and with my few words of Tibetan I thought we had a wonderful conversation that whole evening. And the next day I boarded a truck on the way to Lhasa. Went on to Lhasa, and first I was a tourist. I traveled to different places in Tibet. I got to know Tibet a little. I also spoke to Tibetans and found that the situation was more complex than it looked at first glance. And actually I came to know that there wasn't an opportunity for me somewhere to go and study Tibetan. And Tibetans were discouraged to talk with foreigners. So I felt very motivated actually to study Tibetan by myself and to teach English. So I started to study Tibetan very seriously and also to teach a number of classes in English to different groups of Tibetan classes set up by, in Lhasa for different groups of Tibetans. And it was kind of condoned. It wasn't official, but, anyone was aware that these classes were going on. So I was teaching at different classes. One class was very dear to me. It was actually a class of government officials, Tibetan government officials, who were very good in English, but they didn't have any chance to practice anymore. And they asked me to teach them very early in the morning, before they would go to office. So every morning, when it was still pitch black dark, I would go through the cold streets of Lhasa to the classroom, and there, wearing 2-3 pairs of gloves with a blackboard, work with this group of Tibetans. And of course it helped my Tibetan as well. At that time there were quite a few foreigners, and some of them did the same. They did these English classes, and others were involved in getting to know the country. It was quite open. We could travel around freely. We could extend our visum, for instance, beyond 3 months. So it was quite open. We could interact to some extent with Tibetans. On the other hand, it was also discouraged because of the language problem. So it was that, looking back now, it was probably the most open period in the recent history of Tibet. I went back to the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands I connected with a number of people who were connected to Tibet. Some people had been in Dharamsala in the 70s, in the 80s. They were interested in Tibetan medicine, Tibetan Buddhism. I also found that there's some Tibetans living in Holland, a few at that time, so I connected to them. And they had set up a small kind of organization to keep track of news from Tibet and to interact with people in the Netherlands. So I joined them in that effort. And I also kept up my Tibetan. I started to study with one Tibetan lady in the Netherlands to keep my Tibetan up. Well, actually what happened, the first demonstrations happened in Lhasa in September 1987, exactly almost to the day, 30 years ago. And I remember I was on holiday that time. I was climbing in Italy and I heard the news and I immediately rushed back to Holland, and together with the other people we were talking with news agencies, trying to see what was happening in Tibet, what we could do in Europe in relation to what was happening. So for a week there was a lot of attention to these first demonstrations. What happened on the 30th of September 1987 is that a number of monks from Drepung Monastery, one of the big monasteries near Lhasa, marched down into Lhasa demanding the return of the Dalai Lama and demanding human rights and freedom for the Tibetans. Now, why did it happen at that moment? The Dalai Lama had been traveling to Europe and also to the United States, where he had actually presented a 5-point peace plan for Tibet. And that was rejected by the Chinese government a few days later. And when you talk to monks now who were involved in that first protest, they heard about this peace plan and they heard about the rejection of China. And quite spontaneously, without any real preparation, they decided to march with a little group of monks into Lhasa. And then a few days later, monks from another monastery, Sera, decided to march into Lhasa as well. And within a few days, monks from another big monastery also decided to march into Lhasa. So there were actually 3 protests within a period of 10 days as a spontaneous, quite spontaneous reaction to the Dalai Lama presenting a peace plan for Tibet. So following some news that lasted for about a week, 10 days during the protests, there was quite a bit of international attention to what was happening in Tibet. Tibet had been so closed, there hadn't been much news coming out of Tibet, and I felt I needed to go back to Tibet to see what was the real situation, what was the consequence of the demonstrations, what was really happening. I decided to go back in the beginning of 1988. I traveled to Hong Kong to get my visa to go back to Tibet. The day I had gotten my visa, at night I was watching television in Hong Kong and I saw big riots had erupted in Lhasa. And that same moment there was an announcement that all the borders would be closed, that no one was to enter, no foreigners were to enter Tibet again. And because I'd worked for a travel agency, the travel agency was very interested in knowing what the situation was in Lhasa. So in the end, by becoming a group of 1, because only groups were allowed to go to Tibet, so I had a tag saying I was a group of 1, I finally made it back into Tibet about 3 weeks after I left Hong Kong. It's very difficult to get there. I had a small taxi from Xining that drove me and 2 other foreigners all the way over the high passes in the cold of winter back to Lhasa. But when we came back to Lhasa, the situation was completely different as when I left. When I left, we were able to reasonably openly talk and meet with Tibetans, and we were free to move around Tibet, to go to the different monasteries and places. This time, even when I was walking the street, if I would see a person I knew, we couldn't talk, we wouldn't talk. It was much too dangerous to even have contact. So very carefully I tried to be in touch with Tibetan friends to find out what the situation was. But there were very few foreigners. There were only about, at that point, maybe 8 foreigners in Lhasa. And within a very short period of time, most of us got deportation orders. We were told to leave the country. But at some point, I also got a knock on the door. I thought, okay, you know, maybe I'm told to leave the country as well. But instead of being told to leave the country, I was told that I was going to Shigatse the next day. And when I asked why, I was told that I was going to be interpreting for the Swiss Red Cross. The people knocking on my door was 1 Chinese and 1 Tibetan official. And they told me it was about 9 in the evening, it was already dark, and they said, tomorrow you're going to Shigatse. And I said, well, I mean, do I have a say? What is the alternative? I have a visum that's valid to stay here in Tibet. I had a 3-month visum. And they said the alternative is a deportation order. This Red Cross was the first NGO that got official permission from Beijing to work in Tibet. And this was their first moment. They had just arrived. So the whole project, they were going to teach basic health care to rural doctors and barefoot doctors from the nomad and the village areas. And it was, of course, a great opportunity to work for the Red Cross at a time when actually no other foreigners were allowed to work in Tibet, or to be even in Tibet. So I traveled the next morning early. I couldn't say goodbye to any of my friends in Lhasa. I traveled the next morning to Shigatse and then started working for the Red Cross. Anyway, 3 weeks became almost 6 months. So then at some point the news came that the official interpreter, a Tibetan doctor from Switzerland, had gotten her papers and she was about to arrive. So then I was told I could, you know, stop my work for the Red Cross. And I actually intended on leaving the country. I left the country, and just before leaving I got a letter from a travel agency in the Netherlands. And they asked me if I could pick up a group and take it to Tibet. So I said, sure, great. So I went back to Holland for about a period of 10 days or so, and I brought the group. So I was back in Tibet very, very quickly. And the interesting thing is, by the time I came back, some of it was slightly more open. It was possible for groups to go to Tibet. So there were some more foreigners again. And also at that time, some of the monks that had been arrested after the 1987 and also in the 1988 riots, they were released. So we talked to some of them. And we heard their stories about torture in prison, about their interrogations, about everything that happened to them. We realized that this information is extremely important and that it should be known outside. I had intended to stay on in Tibet when the group would leave Tibet, just to bring them to the border and then to go back to Lhasa and to stay there, try to work there. And then it was the end of, it's the fall of '98. We made a trip to more the east side of Tibet, to one of the monasteries, a very remote kind of place. And when we came back to Lhasa, we saw that there was a huge buildup of Chinese troops. And we were wondering why. We didn't really understand, you know, what would be the reason. So we weren't quite sure why. And then on the 9th of December, at night, there was a huge show of force through Lhasa. Trucks full of Chinese soldiers, armed to the teeth, filling the trucks, and some cars with what do you call them, megaphones, basically telling people not to demonstrate the next day, to stay inside their houses. And it was very intimidating. We were sitting in a little restaurant on one of the main streets, and seeing this come by, extremely intimidating. I was sitting there with a number of friends who were still there, the same kind of people that also spent a little bit of longer time, foreigners in Tibet. Some were doing research in Tibet, some were learning Tibetan. You know, there was a mix of a few foreigners who were really interested in Tibet, who were there, really what to make of it. And so we go back to the hotel, and normally if the authorities didn't want us to leave our hotels, because foreigners could only stay in special hotels, for foreigners, about 5 of those hotels in Lhasa. Normally, if they didn't want us to leave the hotel, they would lock the door. So we were simply locked inside. So the next morning the door was not locked. We went out. We went to the Barkor, that is the main circular road around the main temple, the Jokang temple in Lhasa. And there were a number of, you know, groups of soldiers marching around the Barkor. Normally it's a market, a big market, but there were no market stalls. It was quite eerie. We were actually hoping that there would be nothing, you know, no demonstration. And so, you know, time passed, it became 10 o'clock, and okay, you know, we thought, good, you know, I mean, maybe this is it, nothing will happen. So we went to have breakfast, and then we came back into the market, and, you know, things were starting to become normal, actually. And at that moment we saw from a distance, somehow we saw a Tibetan flag. And then we realized that there might be a small group of people carrying a Tibetan flag, demonstrating. So there was a very small demonstration. They actually walked onto the square in front of the Jokang. We were not close to them. We were quite a while away from them in the Bakwar, that circular road. But at some point we could see that they were there. And then almost at that same moment, we saw soldiers with machine guns running into the street where we stood. And a split second later I was shot. I actually felt the pain on my arm, the heat of the bullet. I felt that before I even heard the shooting. And when we saw soldiers running into the street, we never expected them to shoot. Never. But we started running anyway, when you see soldiers running at you. And even before I was turned around, I was shot. So I heard the sound, and I thought, that sound of ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. I thought, these are firecrackers. And this is why they warn children not to play with firecrackers, because it hurts. And then of course immediately I realized, no, this is not firecrackers. These are bullets, and you've been shot. And I actually wanted to faint, because it was very painful. But then there was a voice in my head saying, no, don't faint, you have to run back into the Bakwar. So I ran back into the street, I pushed myself against the wall, tried to be out of the line of bullets. Next to me came a man, he was shot in the leg. And then we looked at the soldiers, they came closer and closer, and they were still shooting. So we realized that if we sit here, we'll be dead. And we looked at each other and we said, you know, Tadro, we have to run. And so we both moved out in the middle of that small street. He fell, the man, and I ran by myself about 25 meters with Chinese soldiers shooting at me with machine guns. And I heard the bullets just fly past my ears like this. And then luckily I made it around the corner into the first side street. I ran into, there was a door open into a courtyard, and I sat down and I said to two Tibetan women, I said, please help me. I'm shot. I've been shot. And they took me in their house. And because I was screaming with pain, and I remember I was very embarrassed, you know, screaming so much in the house of somebody I didn't know. And these two ladies, they said to each other, they said, well, you know, she's going to die, so we have to make sure that she dies peacefully. And so they took a Tibetan traditional pill, a precious pill, and they cut it in half. And half they made a paste, and they rubbed it in my wounds, and half they burned it like an incense under my nose. I had no effect. And actually, I didn't even know that they were burning this as an incense under my nose. But later, I met one of these two ladies 10 years later, and she told me that is what they did. I was preparing for death. They wanted me to die calmly. They said it's not good to die in agony, in so much pain, this kind of agony. No, they wanted me to die peacefully. But then she said, you kept on screaming, so we realized that you were not going to die. So then they came to me and said, we're going to take you to the hospital. And then I realized, of course, that would be extremely dangerous for them. They may be, you know, arrested for helping me. So I asked them to go out on the street, find any foreigner they could find, bring them back, and the foreigners would take me. And actually there is a picture when I'm taken out of our house, when I'm on the street. I'm in the, you know, hanging on the arm of a foreigner who I didn't know. And actually the woman who took me in her house was so concerned that she's still walking next to us with a dust mask and a hat on, but she's still there. And when we came on the street, there were like razzias, there were trucks parked on the main street, and everyone who had blood on their clothes or who looked in any way like they had been involved were thrown in the trucks. I think the bodies I saw myself in the street, I don't know, of course, when I see bodies, whether they were killed or not. That was difficult. But there were bodies on the street of people who had been shot. One of the two foreigners that this lady found, who was a foreigner I knew, who was a friend of mine, and he took the picture. And I remember when he took the picture thinking, why are you not helping me? Why are you taking pictures? But of course, later that picture was incredibly important. I was brought to the hospital. And by the time we came to the hospital, it was surrounded by soldiers, and we were put in a room. And actually, a few days ago, here in Dharamsala, in the temple, they were commemorating the 30 years of the first demonstration, and they had put up some pictures of people who'd been shot and who later were killed. And when I walked into the temple, I didn't expect to see those pictures there. And I realized 2 pictures there were of people who were shot in the same demonstration, who were in the same hospital room as where I was. I was in the room with them, and they died. And I remember they were on some kind of, you know, stretchers. I was in a bed. There was on the floor a Chinese beggar who had also been shot. So we were there in that situation together, and it's so strange to think about that and to see those pictures 30 years later. But we were brought to that room in the hospital, and then basically they started interrogating me about why I had been shot. And my clothes were ripped, it was very cold. I asked for a painkiller, I didn't get a painkiller. I asked to call my parents, I asked to call the embassy. No, I was not allowed to do anything. So basically the first few hours were only interrogation about the situation. Tibetan doctors were told to leave the room. Chinese doctors came in, they kind of, you know, they put their hands in the wound and they were laughing when it was painful. And then at some point, about 3-4 hours into the hospital, they took me to a room to take x-rays. Because of course, the only thing I knew, there was one point here that hurt, and there was a point in my back where it hurt. But I didn't know whether there were 1 bullet, 2 bullets, whether the bullets were still in my body. I just knew I could breathe, and I was still alive. So the heart and the lungs must be okay. But that's all I knew. And so they took x-rays. And but then when I asked them what the situation was, they said they couldn't tell me because that was a state secret. I said, my body, a state secret? I want to know what's going on. And then a Tibetan doctor came into the room. I knew him, and he was asking, what are you doing here? I said, well, I've been shot. And he went actually to look at the x-rays, and he came back. And it's very interesting what he said. He said, you know, it's not serious. It's just 1 bullet, it's gone straight through. There are no splinters in your body, and get out of the hospital. Don't let them give you an injection. Get out. Right after that, the other doctors came back, and the officials came back, and they said, you know, your condition is very, very serious. You may die, and we're going to operate. So that moment I was very scared. Because I knew actually it was not true. At that time there was also a Dutch nurse, who I didn't know she was in Lhasa, but the lady who helped me, the Tibetan lady, had found her on the street. And she was also with me in the hospital. 2 friends were also with me. And so she was with me when they allowed her to go with me in the operation room. And she checked like the drip before they put the needle into my arm. But then they suddenly told her to leave the operation room. And then again I was quite scared. So I tried to take out the needle, I tried to get up, but then there were a number of police or soldiers, I mean people in uniform with guns. They put me down on the bed, they tied me up on the bed, and then I thought, well, you know, this is it. But then they brought back the Tibetan doctor, and he told me what they were going to do. He said they will just clean the wounds, and that's it. Then they told me I need to stay in the hospital for 48 hours. And I'm not allowed to go, you know, with my, they call them noisy friends. But these noisy friends, they were sitting outside the operation room, waiting for me. And they had been told to go home to eat lunch. They'd been told this operation would take 5 hours. But then, of course, after 20 minutes, they wheeled me out of the room. And when they saw that I was, you know, tied on that bed, and when there were soldiers carrying me out, they got very, you know, they got upset, and so they pushed the soldiers aside. They took my bed. We wanted to run to the exit of the hospital, but we were on the 2nd floor, so we took the elevator. The soldiers ran down the stairs. They pushed the button, so the doors opened on the 1st floor. they pulled out my bed, and I ended up in a waiting room full of Tibetan nomads, with my friends, with Tibetan hospital officials, with Chinese soldiers and officials, and they were all arguing over my head. I remember laying there, hearing them talk about me leaving or me staying in the hospital, in Tibetan, in Chinese, in English. And at some point, I mean, they were telling me there's this lovely Tibetan nurse, she's like a sister to you, she'll really take care of you, don't be afraid. And then another one would tell me, you know, you're a criminal, you should be happy that you can stay in the hospital, you belong in prison, and you know, if you behave like this, we'll throw you in prison. So there was all this thing going on. And at some point I realized it was just, you know, to kind of wear me down. So I just at some point kept repeating, I'm leaving the hospital, I'm not staying here. So about 1-2 hours later, they allowed me to go. I had to write, you know, sign a note saying I refuse treatment. So I signed a note, I refused treatment. And then we left the hospital. And then we went to the Lhasa Holiday Inn, which was the only hotel in Tibet that had telephones in the rooms and heating. And it was, of course, middle of the winter. And I also didn't want to go back to my own hotel, because that was run by a Tibetan, and I didn't want him to be in trouble. Later I learned my whole room had already been raided. My photographs, my diaries, my books, everything had been taken. So there was nothing anymore. So I went to the Lhasa Holiday Inn, and there basically we were under house arrest for 1 week. My passport was taken away, we were interrogated, all the friends were interrogated, and they all received deportation orders. To my friends, they were asking questions about what I was wearing. And they were asking questions about my relationship with the monk who carried the flag in the demonstration. And they were also asking questions to my friends about their relationship with me. It's quite strange, because at some point they asked my friends to bring the clothes that I was wearing to the police station. And they did, because of course all the clothes had the bullet holes in them. We didn't understand it at that time. But later, because when I came out, I went on to testify before the United Nations in Geneva. And when I was there, together also with some of these friends who also testified, the first thing that the Chinese diplomatic mission in Geneva, that the diplomats were saying, was there was no demonstration. It's all a story. Second thing they say, we didn't shoot anyone. Third story was that they shot with rubber bullets, not real bullets. But then they also accused me of having organized demonstration, of having a love affair with the monk who was carrying the flag, of even walking hand in hand with him during the demonstration. There were all these accusations, about 10 days long in Geneva. And then the last one, and this I think really opened the eyes of a lot of diplomats. They said we shot her because she was wearing Tibetan clothes. I was not. And the one and only picture that was taken shows very clearly I'm wearing jeans, I'm wearing some kind of jacket. So one, it was a lie, blatant, because we had that picture. So we could say, well, look, these are not really Tibetan clothes. But secondly, of course, what they were actually saying is she looked like a Tibetan, so it was okay to shoot her. And I think that argument really was the last kind of, the argument that opened the eyes of a lot of the diplomats present in Geneva, and they were all there for the Human Rights Commission, to what was actually going on in Tibet. And then, following my own statement, my own testimony in Geneva at the UN, 6 governments spoke about the situation in Tibet. For the first time in 26 years, there were official statements in the UN about the situation in Tibet. I wanted to leave, but my passport was taken away. Also, I wanted to call my embassy, my parents. I was not allowed to call. But somehow, there were some journalists in Beijing, and they knew if something happens, they cannot call us, but maybe we can call in. So they had managed, when I was in the hospital, they had already managed to call some people in Lhasa. So the news that there had been a massacre, there had been shooting, people were killed, a foreigner was shot, it was all out. And I think it saved my life, that news was out so quickly. So the embassy also, my parents and others, they were trying to call us. And some tried for 2-3 days before they came through. But the moment we arrived in the Lhasa Holiday Inn, there were already some journalists that were calling in. And I think the first that was calling was BBC, then CNN. I mean, they were calling us, so we could get the story out. I was basically in bed that whole week, and whatever news we had from the town, people killed, what really happened. I mean, a friend with me would do the story, and then I would give, you know, some personal account of what happened to me. So that whole week, a lot of the news of what happened in Tibet went out. Now, my friends were interrogated. They all got deportation orders. From me, they took my passport. And they told me, the moment your friends are gone, we put you in prison. They're basically threatening me. But luckily, after about 2 days, the Dutch embassy got through. And they got through right at the moment when the police came to take my passport. So there was a police person sitting in our room while I was on the phone with the Dutch embassy. So I did the whole story. He became very frustrated because he said to one of my friends who was with me, he said, I speak French, German, Chinese, Tibetan, English, but what language she is speaking? And my friend said, she's speaking Dutch. Who is she speaking to? She's speaking to her embassy. He got very, very upset. And then the line was cut. And he came up to me and he said, I want to have your passport. I said, why? He said, I want to check your visum. I said, it's valid until February. He said, I want to see it, give it to me. So I gave him my passport. He didn't even look, he put it in his pocket. And I was laying in the bed, so I just kind of jumped up and tried to grab my passport. And then he slapped me back in the bed. And then I was so scared, upset. I picked up the phone and I said to the person in between, the operator. That time there were operators for phone lines, and I said, I want my line back. I got my line back. And I had the ambassador on the phone. And the ambassador, he said, you know, do one thing, it's great, we know now that your passport is being taken, so that's fantastic, we'll start working to get it back. But also, please make a photocopy, if you can. Ask somebody to make a copy of your passport. So, my luck was that the embassy knew exactly the moment my passport was taken away, they knew it. So there was no delay. So they started working, and at the end of the week, 2 Chinese police, 2 Tibetan police, they came into the room the day before my friends were leaving, and they said, we're here to bring back your passport. I said, great. And they said, but you just have to sign here. But I said, what is this? It was in Chinese. I said, can you translate this for me? They started to translate. I am a criminal. I have violated the laws of China that states that thou shalt not crowd around, follow, or disturb a disturbance, or photograph a disturbance. I said, well, this is a self-confession. You can stop. I'm not going to sign any self-confession. They said, well, great, then you don't get back your passport. And your friends are leaving, so that's it. But, you know, I didn't sign. And finally, 2 hours later, they gave me my passport. And then when they left, it was very interesting, very interesting. The 2 Chinese, they left the room first, then the Tibetan. One of the Tibetan police, he was staying a little bit behind. He turned around to me and he said in Tibetan, sorry, and then he ran. And the other really beautiful thing that happened that week, the most beautiful thing that happened that week, was a monk from Nobulinka. The Lhasa Holiday Inn is next to the Nobulinka, which is the summer palace of the Dalai Lama. And I often went there just to walk around or to talk to the monks, so they knew me. And they knew what had happened. And of course, the Lhasa Holiday Inn was a place where no Tibetans were allowed. Only the ones who worked there. So it was a place where only foreigners and Chinese were allowed. And suddenly, I'm laying in bed, the door opens, and one of the monks from Nobulinka, he walks into the door. And I'm like, Kushala, what are you doing here? He said, we sat with all the monks, and we discussed what had happened to you, and we were so worried because in this hotel, the food is really bad. So here you have like a big Chinese thermos with Tibetan butter tea and a big bag of tsampa, the Tibetan staple food. And he left that with me. I said, Kushula, please, go. And then he left. But he basically risked his life coming into the Lhasa Holiday Inn to bring me Tibetan butter tea and tsampa, the barley flour that the Tibetans eat. So finally I got my passport back, and the next day we all tried to leave together. We went to the airport, but the flight was cancelled. So we came back to Lhasa. We had another day, another night in Lhasa. But by then I think the decision was taken that they wanted me out. Because when we called the head of public security and told him that we were back, that we hadn't left, he was very upset. So I think the next day he made sure that we left. And then we went to Chengdu. In Chengdu there was quite a number of Chinese press already. They wanted to talk to us, and they wanted to fly with us to Canton. And then in Canton there were yet others waiting to travel with us to Hong Kong. Those were more media from Hong Kong that were waiting for us in Canton. And then when we got to Hong Kong, there was a lot of press waiting. It must have been 16th or 17th of December. The next day I went to the military hospital first. I had a meeting there with a military doctor. That was actually the first treatment. He took x-rays and he looked at everything. And he said to me, I've treated thousands of bullet wounds in my life. I have never seen one like this. You should have been dead. He said the bullet went in here, it came out at the back. He said it missed absolutely everything. The tendons, the major arteries, the bones on my shoulder blades, the heart, the lungs. It just touched some nerves and some muscles. I stayed in Hong Kong for about 2 weeks. And there was a lot of attention for the story, so I spoke to a lot of organizations and diplomats and others. Then I traveled on to Delhi. I actually saw His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, briefed him on everything that happened, and just met him there. And then I traveled on to Geneva to testify before the UN. And then for some months actually I traveled to different places in the world to talk about the story, with parliaments, with media, different events that were organized. I really felt that it was important that, because I was the only one who got out, the Tibetans, some were killed, some were wounded, many ended up in prison, no one got out. So I felt enormous responsibility to talk about it, to wherever they would invite me, even if it was just to speak for a few people. I would go and I would talk about it. Get the story out. And it was not, the story for me was not about me. It was exemplary or illustrative of what was happening in Tibet. And if it could happen to me, if this is the way a foreigner would be treated, was treated, I mean, it told a story about Tibet and how Tibetans were treated. I think that because I talked about it so much, even that week in Lhasa, and the months afterwards, I don't think that I was traumatized in the sense of a post-traumatic stress or something like that. Once, a year later, in Holland, it was the first time I was in Holland at home when it was New Year's. And I was walking with, I had a dog at the time, I was walking my dog on the street, and there were some children playing with firecrackers. And the moment I heard the firecrackers, I jumped behind the car. So I thought, oof, this is still quite fresh, that when I hear the sound of firecrackers, you know, I jump behind the car. But that slowly became less. That slowly became less. I have always felt, and what I still feel up to today, is an incredibly close connection with Tibet and with the Tibetans. I have become part of their history. I also felt that one day, I had talked a lot in these years that I worked there with Tibetans to understand the situation, to understand their suffering, also to understand why people had demonstrated and, you know, risked their lives to raise their fist and protest, and about their treatment in prison. But I was always the foreigner, the outsider, talking to the people who were suffering. And what that 1 week gave me, after those 2 years, is that I could share some of their suffering. And that was a very profound and very beautiful experience. I felt almost privileged that I was able to go through that. And that sense of connection, that sense of privilege, which also gives me a sense of guilt. Like, why did I survive? And how can I use my life always, always in the service of others? I studied law. After I did my tour around the world and talked about the story, I felt I am not only, I don't want to be only the girl who got shot, only the victim of a human rights violation. I want to be also using this experience to work, to serve other causes of conflict, other situations where people are suffering. So this very deep motivation came from spending time in Tibet. Often when I was working with conflicting parties or people suffering in a conflict situation, they would sometimes say, like, even though you are a foreigner, you're not from our country, and you're working for the UN, which is a big bureaucracy, we have the feeling that you understand something of our situation. And then I would tell them, maybe it's because of this experience, that I do feel a connection with your situation as well. I worked in Kosovo, I worked in East Timor, I worked in Cameroon and Nigeria, I worked in the Congo, I worked in Nepal, in different situations of conflict or human rights violations. But my motivation to work there, often as a negotiator also, was what happened to me in Tibet. So it has influenced my life in a beautiful way. The most beautiful thing is I think the connection with others all around the world. This deep sense of sameness. And of course, very beautiful. We're sitting here in Dharamsala, in India, very close to the residence of the Dalai Lama. The deep connection with the Tibetans and with him has remained all those years.